To let everyone also know, this meeting today will be recorded. I'd like to start things off by introducing the team from Microsoft who will be presenting today. I will begin with myself. My name is Shane Erickson. My role here at Microsoft is as a modern workplace digital specialist. What that means is that I focus on things like helping customers move to the cloud, whether that be in their office environment, their operating systems, as well as their security posture. The security side, specifically protecting user identities, will be the focus of our discussion here today. With me from the Microsoft side on this call, we also have Arsalan. Arsalan, I'll pass the mic over to you to quickly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Shane. My name is Arsalan Ajani, and I am a technical specialist covering M365. This includes everything from the traditional Office applications that you're familiar with, such as applications like Exchange and SharePoint, to our enterprise mobility and security stack, which includes Azure Active Directory and Intune, among other products. Being a technical specialist, my job is to assist our customers with technical deep dives into our products, as well as providing demos and assisting with proof of concepts.
Thank you, Arsalan. And just to give everyone a heads up, Arsalan and I will be passing the mic back and forth throughout the presentation today. And the focus of today's meeting will be to go over 3 key concepts within our Microsoft solutions. These 3 concepts are designed to help organizations protect their user identities. The concepts include multi-factor authentication, security defaults, and conditional access. We will be presenting a few slides on each of the 3 areas. There will also be a live demonstration towards the end of our presentation. Feel free to put any questions you may have that come up during our presentation in the chat section. At the end of our presentation, we will have some time for a little Q&A session, but in the meantime, Arsalan and I do have some other moderators from Microsoft who will be joining us in the meeting. As we present, they will be able to help field your chat questions as we go. On the slide we have up, it shows some statistics that we've compiled. The stats that are being presented should not be surprising to you, but they should be alarming. These are stats that were discovered by Microsoft's internal research team. It was found that 99% of account compromises can actually be stopped by simply implementing multi-factor authentication. We've also discovered that 81% of breaches are accessed by leveraging stolen or weak passwords. Microsoft security team has also discovered that simply by enabling security defaults, it's actively led to an 80% drop in account compromise rate. So we will start between the 3 topics with multi-factor authentication, or MFA. What is multi-factor authentication? Multi-factor authentication at its simplest is just what it sounds like. It's a method of authentication that requires the use of more than one verification method. Many security authentication systems are based on a simple password exchange method. The problem with passwords is that they are the most vulnerable way to authenticate. Now, I'm sure nobody here attending this meeting today has done this, but I have heard rumors that there are people out there in the world who share password and accounts for online streaming services. Granted, these users likely aren't logging into the service with the intent to steal user or company data, but it does illustrate just how easily it is to sign in fully credentialed as a user by simply guessing or gaining access to common passwords. This is why it's so crucial that we provide heightened security measures. To provide an extra security level of security for sign-ins, the answer is to use multi-factor authentication, which uses something you know, such as a password or a PIN, and an additional verification method based on something you have with you that is not easily duplicated, such as a smartphone device, or something you have uniquely and biologically, such as your fingerprint, face, or other biometric attribute. The second authentication type is not employed until after the user's password has been verified. This means that with MFA, Even if a user password is compromised, the attacker will not have the second set of criteria to complete the sign-in, whether that be the smartphone device, fingerprint, etc. So it stops a bad actor in their tracks. As you can see on the right side of this slide, MFA actually prevents 99.9% of identity attacks. Microsoft Security supports a wide range of multi-factor authentication options. These include passwordless technology such as the Microsoft Authenticator app, which is our preferred method, but we do have several other options. For anyone unfamiliar, the Microsoft Authenticator uses key-based authentication to enable a credential that is tied to a device where the device uses a PIN or biometric. This authentication technology can be used on any device platform, including mobile. This technology can also be used with any app or website that integrates with Microsoft authentication libraries. People who have enabled phone sign-in from Microsoft Authenticator see a message that asks them to tap number in their app. No user, or I'm sorry, people who have enabled phone sign-in from Microsoft Authenticator see a message that asks them to tap a number in their app. No username or password is asked for. To complete the sign-in process in the app, the user must next take the following action items. Enter the number that they see on the login screen into the Microsoft Authenticator dialog, choose Approve, and then provide their PIN or biometric. Another passwordless method is Windows Hello for Business, which consists of a type of user credential that is tied to a device that uses a biometric such as facial recognition, iris recognition, or fingerprint matching. I actually use this with my Surface device every day. When I open my Surface device in the morning, it sees my face. Hello for Business authenticates me using this biometric feature. I don't have to worry about trying to remember my latest password or my PIN. I'm already signed in automatically. If your company uses FIDO2 security keys, these can be used as a form of authentication. And just like we already touched on earlier, biometrics are another way you can authenticate without passwords. We also do have other options available for MFA, which include push notifications, soft tokens, hard tokens, SMS voice, just to name a few. Now I will pass the mic over to Arsalan, who will be discussing ways to enable MFA.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. So there are various different ways of enabling MFA with Azure Active Directory. The first and recommended approach is conditional access. Conditional access is a policy-based service that allows organizations to control access to corporate applications and data based on various conditions and ensure secure access to resources. It is the most versatile way of enabling MFA with Azure Active Directory as it provides the most amount of control. An other way of enabling MFA for users is security defaults. Security defaults enables MFA for all users, including admins, along with a couple of other security policies. Security defaults are primarily aimed at small businesses that might not need the full control over MFA to provide a baseline of security policies to help safeguard your environment and your user identities. We will be discussing security defaults and some of the things to keep in mind when considering security defaults next. Lastly, we also have per user account MFA. This is a legacy way of enabling MFA within Azure Active Directory and not really the recommended approach. Thus, we will not be covering this piece today. So let's talk about security defaults first. As we discussed, identity-related attacks are very common. So attacks such as password spray, dictionary attacks, and phishing are very common in today's environment. More than 99.9% of these identity-related attacks are stopped by using MFA and blocking legacy authentication. Microsoft makes security defaults available to everyone at no cost because managing security can be difficult, and the goal is to ensure that all organizations have at least a basic level of security enabled at no extra cost. So let's dive in to what exactly you get with security defaults. First up, we have unified multi-factor registration. This means that all of your users in your tenants must register for MFA. Users have 14 days to register for Azure AD MFA by using the Microsoft Authenticator app. After the 14 days have passed, the users can't sign in until registration is complete. A user's 14-day period begins after their first successful interactive sign-in after enabling security defaults. This includes all admins as well. Security defaults, of course, also enforces this MFA as well. MFA is enforced for users with privileged accounts, such as admins. When they log in, they'll need to MFA. It is also enforced for privileged actions. So when users are accessing services that allow them to alter tenant-wide configurations. So think of services such as Azure Resource Manager, Azure Portal, Azure PowerShell, CLI, things like that. And then lastly, MFA will be enforced for all users when needed. What that means is Azure AD decides when a user will be prompted for MFA based on factors such as location, device, role, and task. This functionality protects all applications registered with Azure AD, including SaaS applications. Lastly, security defaults also blocks legacy authentication. Legacy authentication is a term that refers to authentication requests made by clients that don't support modern authentication. So think of like the Office 2010 client, and also clients that use older mail protocols such as IMAP, SMTP, or POP3. Today, most compromising sign-in attempts come from legacy authentication. Legacy authentication doesn't support MFA, and even if you have MFA policies enabled on your directory, an attacker can authenticate by using an older protocol and bypass the MFA process. After security defaults are enabled in your tenant, all authentication requests made by older protocols will be blocked. So how do we enable security defaults? Well, if your tenant was created on or after October 22nd, 2019, security defaults may already be enabled in your tenant. To protect all of our users, security defaults are being rolled out to all new tenants at creation. Enabling and disabling security defaults is quite easy. We're going to log into our Azure Active Directory. We're going to go into Properties. And once you go into Properties, you'll see a Manage Security Defaults piece at the bottom. Once you click it, you'll have the option to enable or disable security defaults. In the next slide, we'll talk about some of the considerations of security defaults and why you might want to disable them or why you might look into disabling them. So some of the things to consider when it comes to security defaults. First up is the authentication method. MFA is only available using the Authenticator app when using security defaults. Also, break glass accounts. So security defaults apply to all accounts. You won't be able to deploy a break glass account that won't be expected to perform MFA. This is something we will discuss in more detail when discussing conditional access. Speaking of conditional access can't be combined with security defaults. You can only use one or the other. Enabling conditional access policies will prevent you from enabling security defaults, and all policies that security defaults enables can be achieved with conditional access, and also conditional access provides more control over those policies than security defaults does. Lastly, blocking legacy authentication itself can have various considerations. First, we need to understand if there are users in our environment that are using apps that rely on legacy authentication. We also need to make sure that you're using at least the Office 2013 client and above. And modern authentication needs to be enabled in the Office 365 tenant and for Skype for Business Online. This is only for tenants created before August 2017. And also your Exchange hybrid configurations may need to be updated to support modern authentication as well.
Thanks, Arslan. That brings us to our third and final topic, which is conditional access. So What is Azure AD Conditional Access? Conditional Access is the capability within Azure Active Directory that enables you to enforce controls on the access to applications in your environment based on specific conditions, all from a central location. It is a logical engine checking that users meet certain requirements before they can access resources. It facilitates what happens during the username and password experience. It uses policy called conditional access policies, which at their simplest are if-then statements. If a user wants to access a resource, then they must complete an action. In order to sign on to and use the solutions, the user must meet certain conditions. I will now pass it back to Arsalan to dive deeper into conditional access.
Thanks, Shane. I think this slide does a great job of explaining how conditional access works. So on the left, we have our conditions. First, we have our account. So what type of account do you have? Are you an employee or a partner? What type of user are you? What type of roles do you have? Are you an admin? Then we have our different devices and how much we trust those devices, whether they are compliant or not. This is where the integration with Intune comes in. Intune can communicate back to Azure AD things like if the device is compliant or not. So think of whether a device is updated to the OS we need it to be updated to, and if we require certain settings on the device, such as a firewall, and it's been turned off. Intune can pass along all of this information to Azure Active Directory. We also have location. So the geolocation based on the IP address that a client provides, or even GPS coordinates provided by the Microsoft Authenticator app. You can define your own IP ranges of your corporate network. And also client app and authentication methods. So are you using an actual client app or are you using the browser? This is important because on some of the actual applications, you can apply additional policies through mobile application management piece of Intune. So maybe you need to require a user to be using an actual application instead of the browser. Then we also have some of our dynamic conditions based on data that is coming in to Azure Active Directory from our signals. So AD utilizes machine learning to analyze vast amount of data and user behavior patterns, enabling it to identify and flag suspicious or abnormal user activities that may indicate potential security threats. By continuously learning from past incidents and it's continuously improving its accuracy in detecting potential security risks in real time, thus providing a more proactive and dynamic approach to identity protection and security. We calculate the session risk, and based on that risk, you can apply a specific policy. And then we have the controls. We can allow or block access, which are pretty self-explanatory. We can limit access, require MFA, force a password reset, or block legacy authentication. MFA, as you can imagine, is one of the most used scenarios here, and we can have better control over what applications, what users, what devices need to multi-factor authenticate. There are also other controls for limiting access, such as if a user is coming in from an unmanaged device, we want them to be blocked from downloading content, for example. You also have the ability to force a password reset. This is coming from our identity protection and risk-based conditional access capabilities. So if we detect that an account and password has been leaked somewhere on the dark web, we will flag this user, and the next time they sign in, they will need to MFA and reset their password. Then we also have the ability to block legacy authentication, just like we did with security defaults. However, unlike security defaults, which blocks legacy authentication for all users and apps, we can have more control here with what applications and users we might need to allow this for. And the only reason I can think of for doing this is if you do have a business app that requires legacy authentication. One thing that truly sets Azure AD apart and conditional access apart from our competitors is the scale and the amount of data that's flowing in. We have enormous amounts of data flowing in from all of our systems that is coming into identity protection. The insights from the vast amount of data allows identity protection and conditional access to make smarter decisions and to better protect your users.
Thanks, Arsalan. Conditional access can help companies alleviate many of the identity device concerns they run into. The following are some common concerns that conditional access can help you with. One access concern is based on network location. With Azure AD being accessible from anywhere in the world, different locations make for different requirements. A username and password combination might be good enough as proof of identity for access attempts coming from within your corporate network, but what if an access attempt is performed from a network location that is not under the control of your IT department? And what if you want to go as far as to block access attempts from certain locations? These can both be addressed through conditional access. Another access concern is based on device management. In Azure AD, users can access cloud apps from a broad range of devices, including mobile and also personal devices. But what if you demand that access attempts should only be performed with devices that are managed by your IT department? This can be addressed through conditional access. A third access concern is based on client application. Today, you can access many cloud apps using different app types, such as web-based apps, mobile apps, and desktop apps. But what if one of your users is trying to access a client app that is known to cause issues? This again can be addressed through conditional access. Another access concern is sign-in risk. Conditional access works and integrates with the product Azure AD Identity Protection, which can be used to detect sign-in risks. So if a user attempting to sign in has been deemed to be risky by Azure AD Identity Protection, if they've been deemed to be risky or potentially a bad actor, how do you restrict their access? This can be addressed through conditional access. Now I will pass it over to Arsalan, who will be showing a live demonstration of conditional access.
Thanks, Shane. So I am going to log into my Azure AD tenant, and then I'm going to go to security and conditional access. Here we have two options. We can create a new policy, or we can create a new policy from templates. Conditional access templates provide a convenient method to deploy new policies aligned with Microsoft recommendations. These templates are designed to provide maximum protection aligned with commonly used policies across various customer types and locations. There are 14 templates filtered by 5 different scenarios, which are Secure Foundation, Zero Trust, Remote Work, Protect Administrator, and Emerging Threats. However, for the purposes of our demo today, I am not going to be using the templates, but I am going to instead create a new policy from scratch. The first thing that we need to do here is to name our conditional access policy. Once we have that, we are going to jump into users. Over here, you can assign conditional access policies to all users or break it down further into different types of users. So you can assign conditional access policies that are just targeted to guest or external users. You can even target directory roles such as your global admin, your Intune admin, or other roles. And you can specify specific users or groups that you want to target these conditional access policies to. Likewise, you can also exclude guest directory roles and user groups based on what type of conditional access policy you are trying to create. One thing to note about the user groups. So when talking about security defaults, I briefly mentioned break glass accounts. Break glass accounts are emergency access accounts and thus provide a way to access critical systems and data in emergency situations. These accounts are usually not tied to a user. So if you have a conditional access policy to require MFA for every admin for Azure AD and other SaaS apps, you should exclude emergency access accounts from these requirements and configure a different mechanism. During an emergency, you do not want a policy to potentially block your access to fix an issue. Thus, we recommend if you use conditional access, at least one emergency access account needs to be excluded from all conditional access policies. When using break glass accounts, it's important to ensure that they have strong and unique passwords and that their use is audited and monitored to prevent misuse or abuse. Next, we're going to move into cloud apps or actions. So you can apply conditional access policies to specific cloud applications, or you can target all of your cloud applications through this policy. Likewise, you're also able to exclude applications, but we also have other actions that you can apply to besides just applications. So you can target user actions. So when a user needs to register security information, or when they need to register or join a device to Azure Active Directory, you can target those actions and apply controls to those actions. And then we also have authentication context. So authentication context is similar to the concept of sensitivity labels. With authentication context, we can label the resources that need to be protected and grant access to those labeled resources depending on certain conditions. So for example, an organization may keep its files in SharePoint sites like their product release information that has already been announced, as well as products that are in R&D. Everyone may have access to the products that have already been announced, but users who have access to the R&D site may need to access from a managed device and agree to specific terms of use. Next up, we're going to move into conditions. So first up, we have user risk and sign-in risk. Microsoft works with researchers, law enforcement, security teams at Microsoft, and other trusted sources to find leaked username and password pairs. This is important for user risk because the user risk policy detects the probability that a user account has been compromised by detecting risk events that are atypical of a user's behavior. Risk events require the recording of a user's activity over a length of time so that it's possible to detect abnormalities. Azure AD Threat Intel also picks up on if a user's activity is consistent with a known attack pattern, and you can configure that by your threshold of low, medium, or high. Next, we have sign-in risk. So the sign-in risk policy detects suspicious actions that come along with the sign-in. So it's focused on the sign-in activity itself and analyzes the probability that a given authentication request is not authorized by the identity owner. The sign-in risk policy checks for things like anonymous IP address, atypical travel, malware-linked IP, unfamiliar sign-in property, and for password spray attacks, among other things. And similarly to the user risk policy, you can configure this with your risk threshold. Next up, we have device platforms. This allows for granular conditional access settings based on the platform that the user is coming from. And these include Android, iOS, Windows Phone. Not sure if anybody's still using those. Windows clients, Mac OS, and Linux. And similarly, you can also exclude these platforms as well. Next, let's move on to location. So location provides for definition of known locations used for building lists of network space, usually controlled by your organization. You can have up to 195 named locations with 2,000 IP ranges per location. And we support both IPv4 and v6 named location. Location provides for conditions based on a user's physical location, which is derived from their IP NetBlock geographical information. So I have customers that use this condition to block countries that they deem high risk and do not do any business in, such as Russia or China. You could also just block all countries and allow only countries where you have offices or employees based out of. I also have customers that choose not to require MFA when their users are connected to their network in a trusted location, such as their physical headquarters. In those cases, they create a policy that includes any location, but excludes selected location for their headquarters. Next, we have client apps. These are used to apply different controls based on protocol. Modern authentication clients include browsers, modern desktops, and mobile applications. And legacy authentication clients include protocols such as POP, IMAP, SMTP, and ActiveSync. The typical use case here is for blocking legacy authentication, blocking web access, but allowing mobile app access, forcing unmanaged devices to only use browser for access, and enforce device controls on machines using applications that can download offline data. Lastly, here we have device filters. When creating conditional access policies, admins have the ability to target or exclude specific devices in their environment based on certain conditions. You can filter devices based on things like device ownership, display name, device ID, trust type, among other factors. Let's move on to access control, and let's start with grant. So under grant, we have two options. We have block access and grant access. So block access is very restrictive as you can imagine, just blocks access. Grant access is a little more relaxed because you can require certain things to be true for the user to be granted access. You also have the ability to kind of select if you want only one of these conditions met or if you want all of these conditions met. And first up here, of course, we have require multi-factor authentication. I think you've heard us talk enough about MFA, but one thing I will mention here is that unlike security defaults, you have various methods you can use for MFA here, such as, of course, you have the Authenticator app, but you also can use FIDO2 security keys, OAuth, hardware and software-based tokens, SMS, voice calls, and Windows Hello for Business. Next up, we have require authentication strength. This allows admins to specify which authentication methods can be used to access a resource. For example, an admin can allow any MFA method to access most resources in the tenant, but require phishing-resistant authentication methods such as FIDO2 security keys when their users access highly sensitive content. Next, we have the requirement for a device to be marked compliant. So a device can be marked compliant by Intune for any device operating system or by a third-party mobile management system for Windows 10 devices. This is essentially Azure Active Directory reaching out to Intune to check if the device meets our compliancy threshold and is marked compliant in our MDM. If they are, they gain access. If not, the user will be required to bring the device state to compliant before they can access resources. As part of Microsoft, after MFA, this is the condition I personally run into very often. If I want to access Teams or even email through my personal iPhone, my device needs to be updated to ensure that I am using a device that has the latest updates on it, or else that is increasing the attack surface for Microsoft. So if my device is not updated, it gets marked as non-compliant and I lose access to my email on my phone until I update it. Next up is require hybrid Azure AD joined devices. So this covers all Windows devices originating from an on-premise Active Directory. If the device is not hybrid Azure AD joined, we can block access to certain applications. And then we have require approved client apps and require app protection policy. These are both focused on mobile devices and originate from Intune. The require approved client app requires a user to access applications using the defined client app. So think of like the Outlook application on iOS instead of the native mail application. And then require app protection policy is used in conjunction with app protection policies from mobile application management policy enforcement. These can include bring your own devices, not enrolled in Endpoint Manager. And then we also have the required password change. This is specifically for the user risk piece that we looked at earlier. So if a user is deemed high risk, and we think that their password might be stolen next time they try to log in, we want them to MFA and we want them to come in and change their password. That's where you can utilize this. Okay, let's move into session control. So here we have app enforced restrictions. So this passes device information to SharePoint Online and Exchange Online. SharePoint Online can leverage this information to limit access from unmanaged devices, including denying access to those unmanaged devices. And then Exchange Online restriction leverages OWA mailbox policies for things like blocking downloads and removing offline access. Next, we have conditional access app control. So this provides for integration with Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Defender for Cloud Apps allows for in-depth access to session policies for applications, providing things such as data exfiltration prevention, protect on download, monitoring user session for compliance, blocking access, and blocking custom activities. This integration is really cool, and I personally have a lot of customers using this functionality. So based on conditions that you define as part of your conditional access, you can utilize Defender for Cloud Apps, which is our CASB product, to limit access based on those conditions. So for example, if a user is coming from an unmanaged device, we can let them view certain documents so that they could still do their job, but we don't want to allow them to download these documents to an unmanaged device. This is what app control makes possible. And this is not only limited to Microsoft apps, but also certain third-party apps as well, such as Dropbox, for example. So you can limit users being able to download, print, or cut copy in Dropbox based on conditions defined by a conditional access policy. Next, we have sign-in frequency. So sign-in frequency defines the time period before a user is asked to sign in again when attempting to access a resource. This supports applications that have implemented OAuth 2.0 or OIDC. Use cases for this policy are often scoped to unmanaged bring your own devices. Something to be mindful of here is that aggressive sign-in frequency policies can create user friction and negatively impact that user experience. We also have a persistent browser session. So a persistent browser session allows users to remain signed in after closing and reopening their browser window. Azure AD by default allows users on personal devices to choose whether to persist the session by showing a stay signed in prompt after authentication is successful. This allows for granular overriding of this setting for applications, invalidating the session cookie when the browser session is closed. And continuous access evaluation addresses concerns with access token lifetime and the lag they introduce when conditions change for a user. So the key benefits of this session control include near real-time user session revocation and near real-time conditional access location policy evaluation. We also have resiliency defaults. So when resiliency defaults are enabled, the backup authentication service may use data collected at the beginning of the session to evaluate whether the policy should apply in the absence of real-time data. By default, all policies will have resiliency defaults enabled. This setting may be disabled for individual policies when real-time evaluation is required for access to sensitive applications during something like an outage. Lastly, we have required token protection for sign-in sessions, which is in preview. This is also referred to as token binding. This protection helps to prevent attacks that use token theft by making sure a token can only be used on the intended device. Token theft is when an attacker steals a token to pretend to be someone else until the token expires or is revoked. Token protection creates a cryptographically secure tie between the token and the device it's issued to using a client secret. Without the client secret, the bound token is useless. And when a user registers their device with Azure AD, the device is linked to the user's identity. This makes it harder for attackers to steal or replay tokens. With that covered, we are going to move back into our presentation, and Shane will cover when to use conditional access versus security defaults.
Thanks, Arsalan. So now that we've talked about security defaults and conditional access, let's go over some scenarios where you would use either security defaults or conditional access. So who would want to use security defaults in their organization? Orgs who want to increase their security posture but don't know how or where to start would be great candidates for the use of security defaults. Organizations that use the free tier of Azure Active Directory licensing are also great candidates. Security defaults are better suited for smaller organizations that are looking to provide an additional default baseline of security. Now, who should use conditional access in their environment? If you're an organization that has Azure Active Directory premium licenses currently, you should be using conditional access. If you're an organization that has complex security requirements, you should be using conditional access. One thing to keep in mind is that conditional access is customizable. It allows different levels of security for different people, for different applications, as well as for both managed and unmanaged devices and locations. With conditional access, you can choose where and when to enable MFA or even to block access altogether.
We have some additional resources that we have outlined that might help you in getting started on your MFA journey. We will be sure to include these in our follow-up as well as drop them here in the chat. If you do want to discuss conditional access, security defaults, or multi-factor authentication further, or just need some kind of one-on-one guidance or want to see what it would look like in your environment, feel free to reach out to your Microsoft specialist or your account executive, and they would be able to set something up for us to have more of a one-on-one conversation. With that said, if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we will respond to them here in the next couple of minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can put the links in the chat. Thank you.
Um, we do have some questions in the chat that I could kind of read out if you'll want to take them now. So someone is asking, would using something like Okta be more or less valuable opposed to using Microsoft supplied MFA?
Depends on various conditions and what you kind of have in your environment. Usually the two reasons why I see people going with Microsoft is one, it tends to be cheaper, and two, the amount of data that we have when it comes to identity is pretty much unmatched by any other competitor in that space, just because it's not only data that we are bringing into identity protection from just the business identity piece, right? There's data coming in from other services too, like take Xbox, for example. So if we see a bad actor on Xbox, it's kind of registered in our system. And if those guys decide to go after business customers, we already kind of know what they look like. And that's where we can kind of triage that information. So those are just kind of my thoughts on that question. What is the impact of MFA on user productivity, and how can we ensure that users have a smooth experience when implementing and rolling out MFA? So two questions there. On user productivity, not much. Me and everybody else that is kind of moderating this webinar can kind of speak to that. When I'm logging in to my laptop from home, that is a network and an IP address that I've already MFA'd in from. So it kind of trusts that. So it's not like I'm constantly getting hit with MFA requests. It's when something changes, right? If I go to a coffee shop and I try to sign in from there, that's when I'm going to get an MFA request. So on user productivity, it is not much. It does not negatively impact my productivity. But I guess you have to measure that with like convenience against security. It is not super inconvenient while increasing your security and your security posture greatly. So I would say that that's where it kind of wins out, right? How can we ensure users have a smooth experience when implementing and rolling out MFA? So we actually have a lot of content that we provide for user adoption, such as posters, email templates, infographics, things like that, that you you can use to send out to your users and just kind of get them trained up on those changes that are coming. And then as they're coming, roll it out. And as your users familiarize themselves with it. So a lot of great user adoption content from not only email templates, but also like posters, infographics, things like that.
Thank you so much, Arsalan. Looks like someone just posted another question. How does conditional access work with different types of devices, such as if I'm using a cell phone instead of my laptop?
It works almost the same. So when you are using a laptop, you're signing in, you're getting a request from the Authenticator app that's saying, hey, is this you? And then asking you to match the number. Works the exact same way. So if you're signing in from your phone, you'll still get the same notification from the Authenticator app. You still match the number and it should sign you right in.
Love it. Thank you. And to the initial...
Sorry,
Yes.
John made a great point to also test this with a small group of users. Agree with that 100%. You should roll this out slowly. And also there is something within conditional access policies called what if. And the what if policies lets you simulate conditions. And based on those conditions, you can check what conditional access policies will apply to certain users. So great thing to kind of use when you're rolling it out as well.
Awesome. And Alex is just saying that the what if tool is really helpful. So we're going to go ahead and stop recording now. Again, if you have any questions, we'll still be here for a few more minutes to answer those questions. The recording will also be made available via email after this call, after the webinar. But thank you all so much. Again, keep the questions coming. We are here till 12 o'clock Central. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll be happy to take them.